Hey, if you believe that there is an individual on the planet that has not dealt with stress, then I have a desert in Virginia Beach I'd like to sell you. Listen, everyone in some way, shape, fashion, or form has dealt with stress. Look no further than the two most influential black leaders to date. Look at how President Obama looked around the inauguration period, and then take a look at how he looked prior to boarding Air Force One for the last time. Take a read of some of the negative life events Dr. King had to endure and the subsequent impact that it had on his health. Listen, everyone is dealing with some kind of stress now, and in this presentation, I want to address the ever present elephant in the room because humans in life seemingly always feeds it peanuts, and that elephant takes up a lot of space in our lives. So, in this presentation, we'll define stress in detail. We'll discuss dimensions of stress. We'll talk about how we go about judging or evaluating the type of stress we're encountering. And we'll end the presentation discussing how stress impacts our bodies. Don't get too stressed out about everything we have to cover. Stress is a negative emotional experience accompanied by predictable changes which can be biochemical, physiological, cognitive, and behavioral in nature. These changes are geared toward us either accommodating the stressful event or altering the stressful event. When research on stress was first conducted, folks, there was a big focus on stressful events. Some of Americans' top five stressors included money, the economy, family health problems, and family responsibilities. Nowadays, researchers recognize that what is stressful to one person may be benign or harmless to another person. In other words, our perception of stress is very subjective. Now, given that it's subjective, let's talk about some of the dimensions or characteristics that make events particularly stressful. Negative events in particular tend to produce more stress than positive events. Positive events in our lives can cause stress because ultimately they draw on our time and energy. Positive events that are stressful and often viewed as challenges are technically called eustress, while negative events are technically called distress. Some examples of eustress include an unexpected job promotion, getting married, welcoming a new addition to the family, and plenty of other life events. Those positive events are less stressful than getting a traffic ticket on Thanksgiving Day 2019. I know, very specific, I know, but I'm still a little salty about that. They're less stressful than other events like coping with the death in the family, getting divorced, or experiencing daily conflicts. You see, negative events tend to produce more psychological and physiological distress than physical ones do. Now, uncontrollable events are more stressful than controllable or predictable events. I mean, look no further than the global pandemic the world is undergoing right now in 2020 with COVID 19. If you can control an event, then you're less likely to experience stress. Feelings of control tend to mute the subjective experience of stress and influence biochemical reactions to it. Now, ambiguous events are more stressful than clear cut events. Not understanding a stressor, for hypothetical example, why you can't get along with your friend can be stressful because time and energy is spent on trying to understand the stressor. If something is clear cut, then more effort can be placed on finding solutions to the stressor. So the ability to take confrontational action is usually associated with less distress and better coping. Finally, overloaded individuals tend to be more stressed than individuals that have a balanced workload, and this workload of overload can show up at one's place of employment as well as in one's home setting. Overall, events that are negative, uncontrollable, ambiguous, which means vague or uncertain, and involve overload or anything that involves central life goals are experienced as more stressful than events that are positive, controllable, clear cut, manageable, or involve peripheral life tasks not connected to one's central life goals. All right, so now I want to spend some time talking about the appraisal process. Stress is ultimately the result of an appraisal process. An appraisal simply means to estimate or judge something. Whenever we encounter any kind of event, we undergo two types of appraisals. The first appraisal or primary appraisal occurs when a person is trying to understand what an event means. Events may be appraised for their harm, threat, or challenge. I'll give you this example. When I was a child growing up in Baltimore City, I recall being in a middle school auditorium participating in an assembly, and at the entrance of the assembly, suddenly there were loud booming sounds that were very reminiscent of gunfire I was accustomed to hearing in my neighborhood. Now, in that moment, I made a primary appraisal, or I evaluated and judged that situation. I decided that it was a threat to me, or it could possibly do some future damage, and so I bolted out of my seat for safety. No harm was done to me immediately, and I didn't view it as a challenge. Instead, because I thought it was gunfire, I viewed it as an immediate threat. Now, moving on, we also make secondary appraisals. We assess whether our personal resources are sufficient to meet the demands of the environment. When your resources are present in abundance and you feel like you can meet the demands of the environment, then a person may feel less stress and view the event as a challenge. Challenge assessments lead to more confident expectations that one can cope with the stressful event, and it leads to more favorable emotional reactions to the event and lower blood pressure, among other benefits. Going back to my story, in that moment, my secondary appraisal did not offer any positive results. I was not armed with a weapon to fight off an attacker. The teachers and administrators in the auditorium were just as scared as the students, and thus they could not provide defense. No visible security was around, though I could fight from years of melees with my older cousins. A bullet beats a punch every time, so that wouldn't be a good match. So I quickly, in milliseconds, realized that I did not have the resources I needed to cope with the stressor, and thus I experienced a great deal of stress on that spring day in 1998. After all of that stress, guess what it ended up being? Fireworks. Now let's move forward and talk about how stress engages psychological distress and leads to changes in the body that may have short-term and long-term consequences for health. There are two systems that are involved in the stress response, and they are the sympathetic adrenomedullary system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. When events are perceived as harmful or threatening, they are identified as such by the cerebral cortex, and this information is relayed to the hypothalamus, which initiates the earliest response to stress, which is the sympathetic nervous system. Think of the sympathetic nervous system as a part of the autonomic nervous system that sympathizes with your stress. It sympathizes by mobilizing your body to deal with the stress. Sympathetic arousal stimulates the medulla of the adrenal glands, which in turn secretes catecholamine epinephrine and norepinephrine. These effects result in the cranked up feeling we usually experience in response to stress. This includes increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, increased sweating, constriction of peripheral blood vessels, etc. The parasympathetic nervous system parachutes you down. It brings you back down to a state of homeostasis from a heightened physiological state of stress and may become dysregulated when we experience chronic stress. The hypothalamus pituitary adrenocortical activation is also activated in stress. I'll just call it HPA activation from here out. So the hypothalamus releases corticotrophin releasing hormone, which stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, which in turn stimulates the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids. Of the glucocorticoids, cortisol is especially significant in that it is released, and this helps to conserve stores of carbohydrates, and it helps reduce inflammation in the case of an injury. It also helps the body to return to a steady state following stress. So you see where this HPA axis is playing a role in homeostasis as well. Now, repeated activation of these different entities of the HPA system can lead to compromised functioning with varying levels of cortisol, not assuming a daily variation of increased presence in the morning, flattening in the afternoon hours, and then finally tapering off by the end of the day. Chronic stress or long-term stress can have a profound impact on one's body because the combined activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA system may be a bit dysregulated. Sympathetic nervous system alone is not thought to contribute to compromised functioning because that system is activated when we exercise, and the benefits of exercise are too numerous to really explain here in this presentation. It certainly exercise promotes our health. However, when the sympathetic nervous system is constantly mobilized, in addition to cortisol's constant presence in our body due to the activation of the adrenal cortex, then this can lead to a reduction of the immune system's ability to function, increased blood pressure and heart rate, variations in heart rate, and neurochemical imbalances, which may contribute to the development of psychiatric disorders. Other problems may include storage of fat. Storage of fat may happen more readily in the waistline as opposed to the hips. And prolonged secretion of cortisol can lead to destruction of neurons in the hippocampus, which ultimately affects memory. If you're ever trying to remember what role the hippocampus serves in our brains and in our everyday functioning, just remember this mnemonic. If you saw a hippo on campus, you would never forget it. So the hippocampus is very much connected to our memory. So if we have cells being destroyed in the hippocampus region, then ultimately our memory is affected. Given that stress may compromise the immune system's functioning and the immune system works to reduce inflammation, then pronounced inflammation in a person can be problematic because some level of chronic inflammation, even if it's low grade, is usually implicated in many diseases. Everybody reacts to stress differently, recovers from stress differently, and has indirect signs of wear and tear on their bodies as a result of stress. Reactivity is the degree of change that occurs in the autonomic, neuroendocrine, and or immune system response as a result of stress. Some people are predisposed by their genetic makeup, parental experiences, and or early life experiences to be vulnerable to health consequences linked to stress. These predispositions affect the probability of them getting sick and their ability to recover following periods of cortisol arousal. Generally, the more negative life events and stress one is dealing with or has dealt with, the more protracted cortisol levels will be, and the more susceptible to illness one will be. Allostatic load refers to the physiological cost of chronic exposure to physiological changes that result from repeated or chronic stress. Allostatic load can begin to accumulate in childhood and affect multiple disease risk, as you see on the presentation slide, across the lifespan. Indicators of allostatic load can include increasing weight and high blood pressure, problems with memory, as we've discussed earlier, high waist to hip ratio, as we discussed earlier as well, and many other factors. Now, this allostatic load can occur as one normally ages, and allostatic load can be associated with accelerated aging, as I discussed earlier with President Obama. So, the damage due to chronic stress is made worse if people cope with stress via a high unhealthy fat diet, no exercise, and alcohol abuse. So, naturally, folks, I don't like ending a presentation about stress without talking about how to cope. So, I will recommend that you review research on optimism, that you review research dealing with emotion focused coping, using your support group as a means of processing your emotional experience, problem focused coping, which directly deals with addressing stressors, and proactive coping as a means of balancing this presentation out. Proactive coping essentially deals with lots of forethought and lots of planning, lots of anticipation of stress, and then developing strategies that are designed to effectively deal with that stress. Listen, I know that you can do this. Do that extra research. I think it will help you out. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope that you've gained an understanding of how stress not only affects us psychologically, but on a physiological level, it can alter our bodies and make us more susceptible to illness. So a lot of these changes that are happening on a cellular and molecular level, we may not be sensing in the immediate present, but it can show up in long-term consequences. Take care of yourself, be safe, and pursue wellness.